Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome. Today's topic is Resalest Remarkable Books 57. The first book today is Understanding Mu by Hans Stefan Santason, 1970. This is a tremendous book, amazing book. It's about Lemuria, this civilization, high civilization from the distant past that some people don't believe in, but I believe in because it's the guy who started our church, Paramahansa Yogananda, talked about it. So it's Lemuria, according to our belief, was a continent that existed about 14,000 years ago, and it was a high civilization. We believe, most historians believe in traditional, in linear historical theory, that today we are the most advanced that the human race has ever been. And if the farther you go back in time, the more primitive the world was. That's linear theory. Now, circular theory states that the world goes through cycles of 24,000 years, going up and down. At the top of a cycle, the world is very, very advanced. And at the bottom of a cycle, it's very, very ignorant. And according to our beliefs, that the world reached a bottom of a cycle in around 400 AD. And now we are today about 1,600 years going up in a cycle, but still close to the bottom of a cycle. But we are progressing. And if we went back in time 14,000 years ago, we would find the world was very, very advanced, much more advanced than the world is today. And the thing is, when you get to the bottom of a cycle, there's so much ignorance, and people are so demoralized that they even forget that a past high cycle exists, that there was a past high civilization. And according to our belief, that Lemuria was this great continent, great high civilization in the Pacific Ocean, and Atlantis was the great civilization in the Atlantic Ocean. Atlantis. So, and that the world was really connected. It was one world. Now, I was in the Philippines. I believe the Philippines is a remnant of Lemuria because Filipinos have these very noble qualities. They're very patient and very spiritual, and have humility and very kind, and they're good people. They smile a lot, and I believe they are a remnant of Lemuria. So anyway. This all started, or I guess you could say that it started with a guy named James Churchward, who was a British soldier in India in 1883. He spent 30 years in India. He met a saint there in India who taught him for 7 years the language of Mu or Lemuria, and a lot of wisdom. He taught, and then he was doing this reading about these documents. I think they were things that had been were printed on stone. Anyway, I can't remember. But he was studying these documents in India, which just talked all about Lemuria. And the thing is, India has great spirituality. You could say that India was really, after Lemuria disappeared, India became the high civilization in the world. Westerners haven't really believed in that because Europe became very powerful materially and developed material wealth. And of course the British came to India, and India was a colony of Great Britain, and the British thought they were superior when actually they weren't. They had power, they had wealth and power, but the Indians had far greater wisdom than the British had. So anyway, so this he was reading about this story of Lemuria, and he decided to travel around the world, this James Churchward, looking for evidence of Lemuria in different places. And he went to the United States, Mexico, Central America, all over the world. And what he found was common symbols and common stories. And you think, which those themselves would be proof that Lemuria existed, that there was one world and we were all connected. So he wrote a book. He had this theory and he had evidence, and he wrote a book about Lemuria in New York City, and he wrote several books in the 1930s. And there were people who were interested. However, these historians, famous historians who were working as college professors, they rejected his work. And they thought, this is all nonsense. The thing is, and one of the problems we have in life is pride. And these historians, they had pride. They didn't want to admit that they were wrong, that the whole theory of history is wrong, that it's not linear, that the farther you go back in time, the world, it was not more primitive. Yes, it was more primitive maybe for the last 1,000 years we have been developing. But if you go way further back, the world was more advanced. If you watch the TV show Ancient Aliens on the History Channel, that show constantly brings up evidence which contradicts traditional theory, evidence of things that are inexplicable from the past, evidence of higher civilization in the past than we have today. And so that's why I enjoy that program so much. According to Churchward's book, Lemuria was supported by gas cavities which collapsed, the gas pressure collapsed, and Lemuria collapsed and sunk into the Pacific Ocean. So very interesting. It's you wonder how much. Well, I believe it's true. And the thing is, I read another book on Lemuria. It's kind of hard to study about Lemuria. There's just little, the evidence is sort of fragmentary. It's kind of like trying to know about someone by just seeing their skeleton. But I think in the future, this will be a big breakthrough for the field of history when the linear theory is discarded and circular theory is embraced, and because this will be the true history of the world, because what they're teaching now isn't true. They're forcing facts into into a theory that's wrong. If you have the wrong theory, your facts won't add up, and that's why they reject things which contradict their theory. So I think it's very interesting, and we are headed toward another high age, which I think also is important. There is hope for the world, although we might go through severe hard times if there's nuclear war. Okay, the next book is Gold Dust by Chris Lynch, 2000. I really enjoyed this book. It's a novel, I believe it's a novel, set in 1975 Boston. There are two boys. One's a local white boy from Boston, and the other is an immigrant he's a black boy from Dominica, the island of Dominica in the Caribbean, not Dominican Republic. And they have baseball in common. They're both obsessed with baseball, and they have baseball dreams. Now, this immigrant boy from Dominica, he played cricket, so that's part of his background. And I guess, he also swing a bat in cricket. So the black boy experiences racism. This summer, 1975, Fred Lynn and Jim Rice were the rookie stars for the Boston Red Sox who made it to the World Series, pushed the Cincinnati Reds to Game 7 and then lost, although they had a lead late in Game 7. This is a book of hope, being a kid, cruelty, friendship. He talks about Louis Tiant, who was the star pitcher for the Red Sox and played for Cleveland previously. A boy's baseball dreams in 1975. I enjoyed it because 1975 I was a big into baseball. I wasn't a good player, but although I played and supporting the Cleveland Indians in my case. Wonderful book. The next book is The Commissariat of Enlightenment by Ken Kalfus, 2003. This is an amazing book, tremendous. I believe it's a historical novel. It's good history of the Soviet Union. It starts with the death of Leo Tolstoy, I believe in 1912, and Tolstoy was this famous author, very famous, world-famous Russian author. He wrote War and Peace and other books. I was going to say Anna Karenina, but that may have been Dostoevsky. At any rate, this book is about the Soviet Union and about which the Russians had been under the Tsar, which was like a king, for centuries. And power was passed from father to son, and Russia was a poor country, pretty backward, and then you had this, but there was urbanization, industrialization, and then a lot of suffering caused from the First World War, and the serfs in Russia were like slaves. They were suffering people, and so in 1917 you had this new government. The Tsars were overthrown. And you had the Soviet Union was established, and they came up with radical ideas of government and life for people in Russia, and the Russian different peoples of the Soviet Union. And they were against capitalism. They were against the wealthy, against the Tsar and the nobility. They were against the Eastern Orthodox Christian Church, and they wanted to have a government which would become very, very dominant, control the economy, and really dominate the lives of the people. So the people would have very, very little freedom. And so to do these things, to basically change the culture and the way people were thinking, they needed support from the people, and they decided to use, this was the early years of movies. So the Russians started making these propaganda movies to change to get support for their ideas. That the rich were bad, and the Orthodox Church was bad, the Tsars were bad, and the poor were good, and that the new government was really, really good, amazing, and that Lenin was like, and the leader was like, almost a religious, like a saint, sort of. It was like a new religion. They're creating a new religion. That would be faith in the government and in the country, and in guys like Vladimir Lenin. It was effective. People going to movies. The people were, it really worked to help people for them to gain support for their government and to institute, really, in my opinion, a very, very evil government. Especially trying to eliminate Christianity. Sure, there are problems with the Orthodox Church, but the Christian message is wonderful. It's tremendous. That we should be kind and that God does exist. And if you're trying to eliminate the idea of God, that Lenin was God, that's terrible. And really, it was a government that eliminated freedom. And you could say, well, they didn't have much freedom, but they had even less under the Soviet Union. Now, Lenin had been sent to Siberia as a political prisoner, but and he was actually treated real well. But when he sent prisoners to Siberia, those guys really, they got much, much harder treatment. Then the other thing that's very interesting in this book, there was a kind of a crazy scientist who had an idea about preserving human bodies. And his idea, he thought this, everyone would love it, that once a family member would die, a grandfather would die, that the body could be preserved, and then you could have him propped up in a chair in the house. And I thought, oh, look at that grandpa. Grandpa's still with us. Well, that people wouldn't like something like that. Yes. So this was the thing he was trying to sell. He had a business he was starting because he knew the process of long-term preservation of human bodies after death. And anyway, he approached the government and he met with Stalin with this idea. Now, Stalin had his own ideas, and he came up with the idea, along with this fellow's his methods, that he thought, well, let's preserve. Lenin was at this time was incapacitated. He had had a couple strokes. He couldn't work. He was in poor health, and he was gonna. His death was coming. So Stalin thought, well, let's use this guy's technology. When Lenin dies, we'll preserve his body, and people will come and basically, almost worship it. It will be like a holy icon, like a holy thing. And so, but the guy told him, he says, he told Stalin, he says, the problem is when people die, very often their bodies waste away, and the muscle mass really is reduced, and they become very, very thin, and then their bodies really aren't anything nice to look at because there's just so little of them, and they don't look like they did when they were healthy. And so he was saying, with Lenin, if you want to do this with Lenin, we have a problem because he's wasting away. He needs to die sooner than later. So Stalin decided, we need to hasten Lenin's death so his body will be in good shape. And so they came, and they were, actually they ended up poisoning Lenin, according to this book. And Lenin's wife was very upset. He knew they were up to no good, and she was protesting what was going on. And Stalin, at one point, said to her, "Get out of the way, bitch, or history will run you over." So, in other words, he didn't care what she thought, and he was threatening her, So anyway, they did this. According to this book, Lenin was poisoned, and then, for many years, his body was on display in Russians and the Soviet peoples would come and pay their respects, and basically he was venerated as like a Jesus Christ type person, since Christianity was eliminated, and this was the new religion, worshiping Lenin and the Soviet government. And then years later, Stalin himself died, and then his body was preserved, and they were placed in the same room in this same building. This became like a holy place in Moscow, and people would come to see the bodies of Lenin and Stalin. And although I think Stalin's body wasn't on display that long because he was denounced later by Khrushchev, but in the meantime, while they were laying together, this author is very creative, and he imagines them talking to each other. And Lenin would be angry, and Lenin was angry, would have been angry at Stalin for murdering him. And he calls him Judas, the guy who betrayed Jesus Christ. And then Stalin's reply is, no, Peter. That Lenin was Jesus, but Stalin was his successor, Peter. And then later, Lenin was still mad at Stalin, and he says, you prick. And Stalin replies, eat shit. So it was pretty funny. The dead Lenin and dead Stalin talking with each other. So this was really interesting, a very interesting book, and shows the power of movies, and propaganda. People watch a lot of movies. You wonder what it's doing to us. And people are very influenced by it. In the United States, that's why these commercials during elections are so important in influencing the public. Public opinion is so much affected. So it's a very interesting book. Good history. The next book is He Was Right, Remembering 5 Decades of Accurate Forecasting by Herbert W. Armstrong, Philadelphia Church of God. The Philadelphia Trumpet Magazine, formerly The Plain Truth, by Gerald Fleury, 2010. This is an interesting book. This guy, his name was Herbert Armstrong, was a prophet, and he had this prophecy about what's going to happen in the future. So his idea is that Germany and Japan, they tried to conquer the world in the Second World War, and he said they will try to do it again, and that when the Germans were losing the Second World War. Near the end, they thought, well, we're going to lose the war, so they started preparing for the next war. That they didn't give up their dream of conquering the world. They said, well, we're going to we'll try again in the future. And a lot of them escaped from Europe to South America, and they still had that agenda for a German conquest of the world. And in this prophecy of Herbert Armstrong, Iran. Well, sometime in the future, it still hasn't happened yet, Iran will create a big empire and conquer many countries in the Middle East, really kind of reviving a big Muslim empire, kind of like the Ottoman Empire and previous Muslim empires, and try to actually conquer the world, because Muslims have a belief that they want to conquer the world. And then Germany, will act like the savior and defeat Iran, and everyone will be happy, or at least Europeans will be happy about this. And meanwhile, Japan is creating an alliance in Asia with China and other countries to also conquer the world. And so Germany and Japan, the two of the countries, will conquer the world and then fight each other. And then there will be all this destruction and war. And eventually there will be God's kingdom on earth afterward. So it's interesting. And they have this magazine, the Trumpet, and I'm not getting it any now, but they're always looking for evidence that their prophecy is coming true. That that are about it, especially about Iran, and Germany. So very, very interesting. If you're into history and if you pray and you try, I think maybe you can try to see the future a little bit. And who knows? I think the saints know the future. Of course, there still is free will among human beings. That's why we really can't know the future completely. So hopefully people will today will be turn to God and become more spiritual, so that we won't have to go through horrendous nuclear war. So we'll see. The next book is The Autobiography of Mark Twain by Mark Twain, 1917. This was a gift from my sister Patricia. Wonderful book. Mark Twain was the famous author and funny man in the 1800s. He lived between 1835 and 1910. he had a lot of tragedy in his life. He fathered 4 children, and they all died relatively young. And one daughter, Susie, died at age 24. Daughter Jean died at age 27. And so he had a son named Langdon who died at age 2. All this tragedy in his life. Anyway, and so he had a simple childhood. He talks about his life. He became a Mississippi River boat pilot. He was a silver miner, world traveler, public speaker, very talented and funny. He became cynical. He became cynical about human beings because, I think because of all the tragedy that he'd been through. And he doubted God's wisdom. He doubted God because, again, we don't believe in reincarnation today. I think that's a lot of the problems that we have. That means we have this bad karma from past lives that we're not aware of. And then when bad things happen, we think, oh, what's going on? And why is God doing this to me? Mark Twain was born in Florida, Missouri. He moved to Hannibal, Missouri. His father died when he was 12. That was an early tragedy for him. So he started working at a young age. He worked as a printer apprentice. He became a newspaper writer. He worked as a printer in New York and Philadelphia. He was actually in the Confederate Army for a time. He worked as a silver miner in Nevada and Utah. He developed a hatred for the popular novelist and author Bret Harte. He spent time in New York City and France, traveled in Europe through Italy and then Israel. He published Ulysses S. Grant's autobiography, and he also wrote a book on Joan of Arc. He was a comedian who loved democracy. Very interesting guy. Yeah, he became friends with Ulysses S. Grant, and Grant was the hero of the Civil War, and he was having financial problems. He was a U.S. president. He was an old guy, and having financial problems. And he was actually dying, and so Mark Twain says, "Well, let me write your autobiography, and I'll publish it, and we can make some money for you and your family." And so that they did that. It was a nice thing that he did. And it was a lot of people read it, so he developed income, and Grant died, and so it helped support his widow and his children. So it was really, really wonderful. Mark Twain, really good guy. If you ever recommend his books, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. The next book is People Power, the Greatest Democracy Ever Told in Eyewitness History, The Philippine Revolution of 1986, editor Monina Alaray Mercado and Francisco S. Tatad, 1986. So this is all about what happened in 1986 in the Philippines when the dictatorship of Ferdinand Marcos was overthrown and democracy was restored, and Cory Aquino became the elected president of the Philippines. And it happened, the key events happened at the EDSA Highway in the area where it's now in Metro Manila, what's now the Robinson's Galleria Mall, that area. Now there's a church, the EDSA Shrine. You can go there, go to Mass. And the people were getting fed up with, there had been an election between Ferdinand Marcos and Cory Aquino, the widow of Ninoy Aquino, who should have been president in 1973, but he was arrested and then was in prison and then exiled and then came home and was murdered in 1983, and people believe Marcos was behind it. And anyway, they had this election, and Marcos declared himself a winner, and then the people were upset. And then you had these two guys in the army who decided to rebel against Marcos, Fidel Ramos and Juan Ponce Enrile. And then Marcos was sending in the army to arrest these guys, and then so the people came to protect them. Eventually the army, there was this long, several days standoff between the public and the military finally the military was swayed and moved to the rebels and became, instead of serving Marcos, they were against him. And so Marcos lost support and left the country. So different people, and so it was a tense time, a very heroic time. People were standing up and showing courage and fighting for their country. So the people who, there are people who wrote essays for this book, including Cory Aquino herself, describing what she went through, Ninoy Aquino's mother, Aurora, Freddie Aguilar, I believe, is a musician. James Reuter was a Catholic priest. Jaime Cardinal Sen, a Catholic cardinal. Marcos himself, Fidel Ramos, who played a major role and became president himself later. Butz Aquino, Cristina Ponce Enrile, Gringo Honasan, who was also, I think, he was also one of the guys, one of the military rebels against Marcos. June Keithley, Antonio Sotelo, Jose Maria Sison, I think he's the communist leader. So a lot of things happened. There was heroism, kindness, humor, prayer, forgiveness, nuns versus tanks. Yeah, you see these great pictures of these nuns. They're praying the rosary and facing off tanks. They were protecting Ramos and Enrile. So, and they were giving flowers to the soldiers. So it was a great moment in history. It was world news. People around the world were inspired by Filipinos, ending this dictatorship and restoring democracy. Wonderful book. The next book is The Fires of Jubilee, Nat Turner's Fierce Rebellion by Stephen B. Oates, 1975. This is a good American history book. It's about the 1831 Virginia, a U.S. slave named Nat Turner led a rebellion in which his slave band murdered 60 white Americans, men, women, and children. This rebellion proved that slaves were not contented and fueled the pro-slavery versus anti-slavery debate, which led to the Civil War. And some considered Nat Turner a prophet, a man of God, used by God to show the evil in slavery. Scared a lot of folks in the South. This was their ultimate fear, a slave rebellion, where the slaves would kill white people. So, good history, really enjoyed it, and it was a major step on the road toward the Civil War and the end of slavery in the United States. The next book is Whatever Happened to Super Joe? Catching Up with 45 Good Old Guys from the Bad Old Days of the Cleveland Indians by Russell Schneider, 2006. Well, Russell Schneider went back and interviewed guys from my youth who played for the Cleveland Indians, guys that I really followed and enjoyed, and talked to them about their memories from when they played and what they've been doing in the meantime. Guys like Joe Charbonneau, who was American League Rookie of the Year, 1980. Corey Snyder, Dave LaRoche, tremendous relief pitcher in the 70s. Chris Chambliss, who later became a star for the Yankees. Pat Tabler, Al Ashby, Charlie Spikes, my big hero as a kid. Joe Liss, Jim Bibby, we got in the Gaylord Perry trade. Wayne Garland, who signed a big free agent contract with Cleveland. Dick Bosman, who threw a no-hitter. Dwayne Kuiper, tremendous second baseman. And Fred Bean, Frank Duffy, Jim Kern, Jack Brohammer, and Doug Jones. Wonderful. It appears we're out of time. Thank you very much for watching. God bless you, and I'll see you next time.